Hey, it's Tim and Lisa, and you're listening to the REI Concierge podcast. The REI Concierge helps Americans living abroad find and buy great investment properties in the U.S. From analyzing markets to finding local partners to closing your first deal, we are partnered with you every step of the way. Let's jump into today's episode. Hello, welcome back to another episode of the REI Concierge podcast with Tim and Lisa. We are really excited to be joined by Adrienne Green today. Adrienne is a real estate agent with Keller Williams in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a place that is near and dear to my heart since I have lived there multiple times in my life and I own property there and have family there. And Adrienne, initially I met Adrienne through Gabe Whitmer, who has been on our podcast a couple of times, mortgage banker also in the Chattanooga area. So welcome, Adrienne. We're so happy to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I will also just take a quick minute to advertise your YouTube channel. We'll put a link in the show notes, but Adrienne had Tim and I on her YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen that episode, check that out. And I will also just quickly say, as I extend this introduction even longer, Adrienne is a longtime real estate investor, multiple areas, multiple markets in the U.S. And we're really excited to hear more about your journey and your story.
Oh, I'm happy to share all about it.
So let's share all about it, Adrienne. Why don't we start? Let's start on, there's a lot of stuff we want to get into, including your real estate business right now on the sales side, as well as Chattanooga as a market in general. Because like I said in the beginning, we're trying to do a little bit more of some market deep dives this season as we explore some of the partners we work with in certain markets and why we chose them. And to hear it from you guys on the ground is much more useful than Lisa and I just reading off numbers and facts. So before we get into that, why don't we start with your actual investing career? Why did you get into real estate investing in the first place, and where'd you get started? And just kind of take us through your journey from where you started to now, and what you're doing in the near future.
Sure, that's fabulous. Happy to do that. So I in California, and I had studied business and finance, and then after working in that industry a little bit, wasn't my cup of tea, and I taught high school math. And so that, through my husband's career, took me to Northern Virginia. And so I was teaching math there. And then I stepped back for some other stuff. And we got started with real estate investing, honestly, because we bought a single family house that we thought would be our forever home. And it was just the two of us. And it was much bigger than we needed. So, it had been plumbed for a wet bar in the basement. So we went to IKEA, got everything to make that a kitchenette, and set up a kitchenette in our basement and started renting our basement out. And so, we started with house hacking. It was really because we didn't use the space and we were out in the country, and it was kind of like, we're not using it. Let's let someone else use it and make a little money. It wasn't a huge master plan of, financial independence or anything like that. It was just kind of happenstance. And we knew people who rented out, spaces in their house or former primary residences. And my husband's coworkers had done that. And so honestly, we asked them for copies of their leases and kind of wrote up our own. And that's how we got started.
Nice.
That's awesome. I don't think we've had anyone on the podcast. So everyone I think that we've had on the podcast so far has had that, what do you say, like grand scheme of financial independence in mind. Like they've read Rich Dad, Poor Dad or some other real estate investing book. And they're like, this is what I want to do. But you're just like, we got a big basement. Let's make a couple bucks.
Yes.
I love that. And then you're like, oh, wait. This covers a lot of our mortgage. Let's keep going.
Exactly.
Awesome.
And that's what led to then we got into more of like, reading about, the wealth building of real estate and everything like that. And it was maybe 6 months later, I want to say, that we ended up buying our first pure investment property, because we were like, whoa, we already know how to vet tenants. We know how to write up a lease. This is great financially. So, that ended up being in the Northern Virginia market. We focused on condos as a combination of, my husband working full-time and me also working full-time. Condos were the easy thing to do, and they were relatively inexpensive. So they actually cash flowed, which is tough to find in the Northern Virginia market. So we expanded to eventually 4 condos there. Then we got into out-of-state investing with a short-term rental in Myrtle Beach, which we also bought on a whim. We were there on a vacation because somebody had given us like a free week there, and we happened to have a pre-approval from, a long-term rental that we didn't win on up in Northern Virginia. So ended up with a house in Myrtle Beach. And then in 2020, my husband was working remotely, and we decided to move out of Northern Virginia, and evaluating different markets for both living and also real estate investing, landed on Chattanooga being the ideal place. Top reasons were Tennessee having no state income tax, Chattanooga having great real estate investing, and being, a mid-sized city where there's a lot to do, but it's not so big that there's congestion or traffic or, a major expense to do things. So we have a lot to do here, baseball, aquariums, museums, natural, hiking, river, etc. And you can get to anything in less than half an hour. So we've then since expanded to multiple properties in Chattanooga. There's so many deals here. I feel like we have 4 or 5 houses now. We're under contract. We pick them up. You know how it goes after a while, so it's hard to keep track. And then we're also under contract on another short-term rental in Myrtle Beach as well right now.
Nice. So I would love to hear a little bit. You've already mentioned you've got long-term rentals and short-term rentals. Would you be willing to do some compare and contrast for us between owning the two, managing the two, or I would imagine you've got property management, so managing the property management of the two different ones?
Sure, of course. So long-term, my view of short-term rentals is evolving, is what I would say. So, traditionally I would figure long-term rentals, you're going to have less return, but it's a lot less work. And that's definitely the case. I mean, some of our long-term rentals, we don't hear from them at all in a year. I would say typically in our long-term rentals, we're going to hear from them standard 2 times in a year. High maintenance tenant 4 to 6 times in a year, and it's going to be something like, the dryer's making a funny noise, or, there's been like water leaks or things like that. Or once we had a tenant complain that water, and this was a house, when we first moved to Chattanooga, we moved into a house that we knew we'd keep as a rental. So it was a house we had lived in for a few months. And so I knew it well. And she's like, water's coming in under the back door. Like, well, that never happened during a rainstorm. I was like, that never happened while we were there. Well, they had not cleaned the gutters above the door. So water was splashing out of the gutters onto the door and therefore leaking in. And so when I suggested that she, get some photos or videos of this in that process, she saw the leaf issue and was able to resolve it herself. But let's say long-term rentals, they're pretty hands-off. You're usually dealing with, let's say, 2 to 6 instances in a year. And the other nice thing is, typically, so I tend to do A and B class long-term rentals for reference. Typically people are staying 1.5 to 2.5 years is our average stay, I would say. So you're dealing with tenant turnover, relatively infrequently. The cons are, of course, lower return. And then if you do have a tenant who has issues with rent, that can be an issue. That's not something you deal with in short-term rentals, like they pay before they show up. Versus long-term rentals, if you've got somebody who doesn't pay their rent and you're having to do pay or quit notices, or, heaven forbid, evictions, like that is a thing with long-term rentals that isn't really a thing with short-term rentals.
Mm-hmm.
And then with short-term rentals, everybody thinks they're a lot more work, and they can be, but I would say there's so many people are doing short-term rentals now. Well, first off, okay, if you're going to do property management with short-term rentals, it's very expensive. And I feel like it's very difficult to get the added, the added return, money in the bank. ROI.
It can be like 30 or 40%, can it, Adrienne?
It can.
Like
it can.
I mean, just for people that don't know property management, it's usually like 8 to 10-ish% for long-term rental property management, but it can be like 30 to 40% because there's so much more work involved. But some people don't realize it's that much more than a typical long-term rental management.
You're exactly right. So in Chattanooga, the standard long-term property management is 10%. And then the short-term rental managers here, some of them are 15 to 25, some others are 30 to 40, like you said. So And I would say in more short-term rental markets, like I've spoken to property managers in, Sedona, Arizona, or, vacation destinations in Texas. And yes, their standard is 30%. Um, if you get a high-end house in a vacation destination, like an oceanfront house in Myrtle Beach, you can usually negotiate it to be more like 10 to 15%. But
Hmm.
we're talking if you're getting like a multi-million dollar house. So,
Right.
10 to 15% of, $300,000 in income is still a lot for that property manager.
Sure. Yeah.
So I would say that while short-term rentals are definitely more work, there are resources that help with that that weren't necessarily available there in the past. So a couple that I have personally run across recently is there's this web platform called IGMS, and that is an all-in-one resource that you can join for a small fee, and it connects multiple different avenues. So, Airbnb, VRBO, a direct booking website, things like that, and you can do it all in one place. You can set up automated messages, things like that, and so it lessens the workload of having multiple short-term rentals. And then another resource I saw is something called Host GPO, which is a group purchasing something. And what it allows is multiple, short-term rental hosts to join for, I mean, it's a $10 a month fee if you have, I think, less than 10 short-term rentals. And that gives you effectively wholesale prices at multiple retailers, linen providers, things like that, because you do have to consider with short-term rentals, you have to have it furnished, you have to replenish the furniture as it gets wear and tear, you have to provide linens, and those are added costs that you don't have with a long-term rental.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And that makes, I mean, technology continues to make our lives less and less difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice to hear about some of the platforms that are available.
Yes, and I think that it really makes the difference for short-term rental. And the other thing I think of for short-term versus long-term, and honestly, I like to have both for a diversity standpoint and like a diversification of portfolio kind of thing. Uh, but a benefit of a short-term rental is, of course, that if you're going to visit that and work on it and check on it, you can write off that trip, or at least part of it, depending on your time and what you're doing. And so that's a big benefit of real estate investing is, those tax benefits. And so I do support or suggest to clients that they consider if there's an area they'd like to vacation, it could be great to buy a house as a short-term rental there because you get to enjoy it yourself, have those tax benefits, and get a good return.
Listen to the full podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google, or any of your favorite podcast apps.